I edged out of the kitchen and into the sunroom, stepping in time to the chop, chop, chop of the cleaver. I knew not whether to call for my uncle or run from the house, and surprised even myself that I did not scream. I stood instead, waiting for the chopping to stop. It did at last, just as the piano playing had commenced, and when I at last peeked into the kitchen, the hand was gone and the cleaver lay where Mrs. Hastings had left it. There were, however, new cuts on the chopping block, freshly made, and the depths of the cuts spoke of the strength that lay in the hand. What did this mean? Was I to go on living like this the rest of my life, never knowing when the severed hand would show itself, or what it might do? If it could hold a cleaver and bring it down with such force, were any of us safe? Strangely, as frightened as I was of the apparition, I could feel anger growing inside of me, and a determination to catch this wayward hand and return it to its grave. If it was I who had awakened the ghost by bringing my mother's picture frame into the house, then it was I who would get rid of it, and that I made my mind up to do. My uncle and Mrs. Hastings had evidently found the evening air much to their liking, and stayed out in the garden for some time, looking at first this flower, then another, while I cleaned the kitchen. I worked furiously, scouring, sweeping, soaping, rinsing, for my thoughts were all a-tumble, and I did not know if my feverish activity was due more to anger or terror. Nonetheless, when I went out at last to join my uncle, I said, "Uncle Geoffrey, I am afraid we might have rats, and I would like some traps to set about." "Rats? Surely not," cried Mrs. Hastings. "I have seen some signs, droppings and holes in the root cellar the size of tennis balls. If you'll get traps for me, I know right where to put them, for if there are rats in the cellar, then they must be elsewhere in the house too." "If we do have rats, we will make short work of them. I'll ask Zeke Carey to bring us traps tomorrow," said my uncle. I wonder that I slept at all that evening. If Jade Green had cut off her own hand with a meat cleaver, what might she do to me? Was I in her favor or disfavor for letting her back in this house? At times, my answer was that if she had meant to harm me, she might as well have done so already. But the argument ran that perhaps she liked to toy with me first, even to drive me mad. Yet why? Why had she left in so terrible a manner, and for what reason had she returned? The following day, the rat traps were delivered, and the day after that, when Zeke was waiting for me with his horse and wagon outside of Helene's hat shop, I climbed up beside him and said, "I would like to go to the cemetery, Zeke. I'd like to see the grave of Jade Green." "Now that's a morbid thought for such a beautiful day," he said. "I just want to see where she's buried," I told him. It was a good enough excuse as any to take me riding, Zeke probably thought, for he turned the horse in the direction, and off we went. As we entered the gates of the graveyard, though, Zeke said, "You know, Judith, there are times I worry about you." "Why?" "The way you brood about Jade Green, for one." His words disturbed me, that he should think me odd. Had he seen some trace of my mother's madness in me, something of which I myself was unaware? How glad I was that I had not told him what I had seen so far in the house. "Is that all that troubles you about me?" I asked. "That and other things." "What other things?" "Well, the picture you gave me, of you at 10. If you don't want it, Zeke, you can always give it back. You don't understand what I'm saying. You were upset that night, like a desperate girl wanting to rid herself of the pox. What is it you're not telling me, Judith? There's more to the story, of that I am sure." His words were all true, yet I wanted Zeke to think only the best of me. So I told him that it was a strain living in the house where a girl had once taken her life, and that perhaps when I saw where she was buried, I could put the matter to rest and forget about Jade Green. Zeke seemed to accept this as reasonable. What would he think of me, I wondered, if he knew that I was planning to capture a severed hand and bury it here atop the grave where it belonged. The sky had been gray that morning, and continued gray even now, clouds billowing overhead like the froth in a soup kettle. For some time we rode in silence, and then Zeke said, "My father saw your cousin in the bib and bottle last night. The way Charles was talking, it seemed he would have people believe that your uncle is becoming senile." "Why on earth would he talk so?" I exclaimed. "Indeed, Uncle has all his faculties about him, and I have never noticed him to forget the slightest detail. He keeps every appointment, arriving on time, and attends to his obligations better than most of us." "That is how my father answered him. That if Geoffrey Sparrow were becoming senile, then there was no hope for the rest of us, for he's as punctual as a clock and sharp as a pin." I was puzzled, though, that Charles would tell such a lie. "For what purpose would a man tell falsehood about his own father?" I asked. "That's what I asked my father. He tells me that, if your uncle were to be declared incompetent by the court, Charles would inherit his estate, being his only living heir, with the exception of you, of course." "Me? I'm only his niece," I replied. "But an heir nonetheless. It all depends on what your uncle has written in his will. Regardless of what the will says, though, my father tells me, if your cousin can convince the court that he should be declared invalid because your uncle was not himself when he wrote it, then Charles would stand to gain a great deal." I did not like to hear this talk, for it saddened me to think of Uncle passing away. Should that happen, I'm convinced my cousin would have me barred from his house without a penny to my name. I sat thinking how I should save every cent I earned toward the day that this might happen. I had been doing as Mrs. Hastings advised, turning over the greater part of my wages to her, where she kept them, she told me, safe in her room. When they reached a certain sum, she said, she would give them to my uncle, and he might invest them properly for me. And though I wondered if it was wise to turn my earnings over to anyone, even Mrs. Hastings, I knew no better plan except to go to Uncle each week with my meager earnings, and I did not care to trouble him with that. We were nearing the cemetery now, and the horse seemed surprised when Zeke pulled on the reins, turning him into the entrance and along the winding road among the tombstones. The horse tossed its head and whinnied softly, but Zeke patted him and said, "It's okay, Dusty. A quick trip and we'll be on our way again." I wondered that Zeke should show just where Jade Green was buried, and at first he could not find it, mistaking one gentle slope of green for another. But at last he said, "There it is. I remember now. She was placed near the oak tree, and there's her tombstone." He pulled the horse and wagon to the side of the road, and I sat for a minute, unsure of going near the grave. But at last, regaining my courage, I let myself down, Zeke by my side, and slowly walked over toward the weeds were already overtaking the headstone. It read thus: Jade Green, April 7th, 1869, February 22nd, 1884. So short a stay upon this land, we grieve her death by her own hand. I wanted to take a closer look, and I knelt down, brushing away the ivy that was twisting itself around the stone. I saw that someone, or something, had made a scratch along the last line of the verse.